So recently, Christian from Canguro English uploaded a video to his channel called The Myth of Input. I know how YouTube works, so I thought he's probably just playing the game a little bit. I'm sure he doesn't actually think that the whole you learn a language through input thing is a myth, but having watched the video several times now, I'm quite surprised by what he says. And initially, I was just going to essentially watch his video and kind of react to it, but the more times I watched it, the more I came back to this idea that I've actually done a 180 on in the last year and a half or so. I used to very strongly believe in speaking a lot and speaking early. You can find evidence of that all over my channel from about March 2020 and before that. I repeatedly say in various videos that speaking early and speaking a lot is the way to go. I advocate for things like recording videos in your target language even if you don't speak it very well. Lots of things that I would be much more reserved about recommending today. So for the people who are going to say, well, Lamont, you're just looking for things to support your theory and you're not willing to hear anything that's outside of that, that's not true at all, because like I say, I've done a complete 180 on this myself, so I'm essentially going to use Christian's video as a base to talk about why I've come to believe what I believe.
Here I am, I've become the very thing I swore to destroy.
Now I shouldn't really have to say this, but I will just in case. I like Christian. I like his channel. I've actually kind of stolen his definition of fluency in a couple of my own videos, but more importantly than his views on language learning is his personal character. He gives tons of money to charity, including 100% of the profits from his current grammar course. He's done work building schools in the developing world, all good things, and I'm sure lots more things that I don't know about. And he's also fantastically eloquent and is able to make like really long videos without once saying the word or referring to notes or making a single cut, which is insane to me, and it's something I wish I could do myself. So if you're learning English and somehow you haven't already found his channel, you should definitely take a look at it. And also, just to be sure that this wouldn't be taken the wrong way, I did get in touch with Christian just saying, I'm going to make this video, there's no hard feelings, and of course he has very thick skin and he doesn't mind at all. He said, no worries mate, go for it, looking forward to seeing the video. So there's nothing between Christian and I that is making me make this video. I just think that there needs to be some response to this. Now, you might be wondering why this video is so long. I want to make sure that I'm responding to the whole argument as best I can, and it will include bits of Christian's video themselves, although those bits will be sped up. So believe it or not, this is actually one of 3 videos responding to this because there is a lot to cover. And no, it's not just going to be 3 videos of me going, that's dumb, and just then he said 7 different things, all of which are wrong. No, like I said, there's a lot to cover, there's a lot of nooks and crannies, and I want to try and get into as many of them as possible. And besides, Matt and George put out a total content count of like 5 hours about pitch accent, so I'm allowed to talk for 40 minutes about input.
Anyone who has tried to learn a language knows that there are a million different learning systems and methods out there, and a million different people trying to sell them to you. But after a while, you will probably notice one idea that everybody seems to believe in, and that is the importance of input.
Okay, so straight away I have a problem with this assertion because although you can get this impression from the online language learning space and particularly on YouTube, it is still very much not the mainstream view that a language is primarily learned through input. And this is from my experience with almost anyone I've spoken to who isn't already watching my channel, and even a lot of people who are. I just reject the idea that most people even know what you mean by input. The input hypothesis is actually quite counterintuitive, and I feel it's, to most people, so counterintuitive that when I try to explain it to them, it feels a little bit like trying to explain the offside rule in football to someone who doesn't understand that one team is going that way and the other team is going that way. Like, imagine talking to someone who believes that one goal is like out of bounds and the other goal is the one that both teams are aiming for, and now explain offside to them. It's not really possible. And the more I try to explain it, the more I feel like it's just a journey that most people have to make for themselves. Like, they'll just one day start to think this way round, if they start at all, but that my explanation of it to them will often result in them saying, oh, okay, so you're saying this, and I'm like, no, not at all. That's not what I'm saying.
Sometimes entire learning programs are based only on providing input. and on the idea that input is the only thing you need to learn a language.
Okay, I'm not sure which language learning courses or programs he's talking about here, but again, that's pretty rare. If you look at most popular language learning courses, even if they are really input heavy, they generally don't promote that about themselves because, like I said, people kind of think that the input hypothesis is snake oil. And these days, the most popular apps or pre-packaged courses, for example, Michelle Thomas, which is right there on my shelf, it's output heavy. Now, I actually think Michelle Thomas is pretty good, depending on your goals for beginners, but it is output heavy. So I'm rejecting the idea that input is like the primary thing that most people are on about. Even Speakly, which is probably my favorite and I think possibly the most legit language learning app I've tested, it still promotes output and it still forwards the idea that by practicing a scripted conversation, you're ready to then have that conversation, which is then in turn promoting the idea that by practicing saying one particular thing, you've practiced saying everything else within that category, which is false. And as for Christian saying that some things say that input is the only thing that you need to learn a language, some people are more hard one way on this than others, but very, very few people say that input is the only thing that you need to learn a language. That is actually taking the least intuitive part of the input hypothesis and making it the main idea of what you're saying. So it's just always going to be unpopular to do that, and for that reason, most people don't do that. Now, yes, there are some who say that, and I'm actually going to look at those examples later.
Is due to the influence of one man, Stephen Krashen, who is often viewed as a legendary figure in the world of language learning. He proposed the input hypothesis back in the 1970s, and his ideas have been enormously popular and very influential on the world of language learning during the last 50 years.
Again, I know his ideas have not been that influential. They can seem that way if you're only watching like Matt versus Japan and Steve Kaufmann and going on the input-based subreddit or something, but outside of that, a lot of people have never even heard of him, and if he was really that influential, then the most popular apps like Duolingo and Babbel would use his name. They would go like, we use input as proposed by Stephen Krashen or something like that, but they never do that. And myself, I would never have heard of Stephen Krashen if it wasn't for Matt versus Japan, which I will, very importantly, come back to later.
We don't acquire language when we speak. We don't acquire language when we study it. We don't acquire language when we memorize lists of verbs, et cetera, et cetera. We don't acquire language when we get corrected. All those things like grammar, vocabulary are the result of getting comprehensible input.
It sounds great, right? No speaking, no study, just input. It's the dream of any language learner. There's just one little problem with the input hypothesis. It's total.
Okay, so it hasn't made itself clear yet, but it's going to be important later that we see that Christian doesn't know, and I mean really know and understand that there's a difference between learning a language and acquiring a language, and that is where he gets the audacity to say that it's total BS. Now, I can completely sympathize with him because I felt exactly the same way not very long ago. I had taken a speak early and speak a lot approach with Swedish and French, and it worked in that I could speak Swedish and to a lesser extent I could speak French. So I was very cocky that speaking from day one was the only way to really learn a language, and there's evidence for that all over my channel. And I think there is a bit of a false dichotomy happening where people think that there are two schools of thought on this when there are in fact three, and they're all very distinct. The first and most traditional school of thought is that you learn a language through studying the language. This is a verb, this is a noun. In English, adjectives go before the noun, blah, blah, blah. Call that classroom study. The second, the one that I was a very firm believer in, is the one that says, well, if you want to learn French, then start speaking French. If you can only say bonjour, then say bonjour. If you can only say je m'appelle Lamont, then say bonjour, je m'appelle Lamont. But don't you say that because that's my name. This is what I did for 3 years in Swedish and 2 in French. Call this one the speak early school of thought. I think this school of thought is the predominant one in this era, and I think it's quite distinct from classroom study because it flies in the face of classroom study. In a way, it's the least traditional and the most rebellious. It says, to hell with grammar and learning, just speak. The thing about this school of thought is that it is very effective, particularly in the early stages, like say less than a year, and particularly if the language you're learning has some similarity to your own, which Swedish and French both do, and which Spanish, which Christian speaks, also does. But, as I can well attest to, the diminishing returns on the speak early approach are very real, and you can actually see it pretty clearly in this video, where the speaking level I have in Swedish after 18 months and 3 years are actually pretty similar. There's a very quick progression from nothing to a decent level in a year, but after that, it's very hard to show. And remember that when I edited this video, I was trying to show that speaking early does work, so I was, as much as I could, deliberately selecting clips that showed my progress, and I wasn't really finding them because they weren't there. Now, the last school of thought, and remember, I think there are 3 distinct schools of thought on this, is the mass input school of thought, and I'm going to talk more about that after we've seen some more of what Christian has to say.
The first problem is that the hypothesis can immediately be shown to be false by a specific but very common group of people called receptive bilinguals. They are people who have a highly proficient understanding of language, but they cannot speak or write it. This situation is really common among the children of immigrants. The family moves to a new country, and the parents continue to speak the language of the old country, but the children will adopt the language of the new country. And in that situation, it's common that the children will be able to perfectly understand the language of their parents, but will have a varying ability to express themselves. Now, you cannot argue that these children are not receiving comprehensible input. And not only is it comprehensible, but it is meaningful. It is input from their own parents about their own life. Yet, some of these children cannot speak or write the language of their parents.
Okay, yes, great argument. This is the best argument that Christian brings in his video, so it does deserve some attention. I am going to spend some time on it. Now, the variables in these cases are way too numerous to mention. Even just in the cases I know personally, there are 6 different results from 6 different sets of circumstances, and what I say is obviously anecdotal. But let's say that we have a child of Chinese parents growing up in Australia. Assuming they go to preschool and then the first year of school, by the time they're 6 years old, they've almost certainly had much more exposure to English than they have to Mandarin. Every time they go to a library, every time they go to a park where there are other kids playing, every time they go to a shop where the TV is on, all the signs around them. Very few kids get the same exposure to the language of their parents as they do to the national language. And by the way, even if that were the case, very few kids care as much about what their parents are saying as they do about what's on TV. My 10-year-old, for example, will happily watch Swedish YouTube despite the fact that he has no idea what's going on, because it's bright and colourful and there's music and there's stuff to click on and there's just more interesting things going on than when I'm just talking to him. This is why countries like, say, Denmark and Iceland traditionally speak a much higher level of English than countries like Germany and France, despite the fact that English is taught from basically the same age in all of those countries. Denmark and Iceland have always spoken English really well. Germany and France are only just now starting to catch up. Now, why is that? Well, the internet is getting old enough now that we see adults who have grown up with the internet, meaning that they've grown up with things in English, like Denmark and Iceland and Norway and Sweden have always done.
Amazing Grace.
Oh, yeah!
So anyway, let's assume that by the time this child of Chinese parents is 9 or 10, it's just easier for them to speak English, because as Christian says himself in this video, everyone has one language that they prefer. So I would argue that the cases of, say, 18-year-olds who have had statistically similar amounts of input in Mandarin and in English living in Australia are actually super rare anyway, because they still went to school in English, books and TV were in English, maybe 4 or 5 times as much, even if they took advanced Mandarin at school. But let's assume that there is this strange case where the input was at least equal in Mandarin and the output was in English, which is what Christian's talking about here, receptive bilinguals. Maybe someone out there is claiming that an 18-year-old who doesn't speak regularly will be able to produce Mandarin fluently, but most input supporters, including Steve Kaufmann and Matt, are in fact saying, no, Mandarin will still feel strange to them. They will have trouble making a lot of the sounds, they'll probably have a weird accent, and they'll make mistakes. They may even be aware that they are making mistakes, which will mean that the mistakes are even more frustrating. And if they don't know any better, assuming that they're not into this field of study, that will make them feel stupid, guilty, and they'll just speak English because it's just easier, which will in turn mean more of their input is in English because they'll speak to other English speakers. And for most people, it just becomes a downward spiral. On the other hand, if they're aware of why it might be difficult, if they think to themselves, well, actually, I've had a lot more exposure to English than I've had to Mandarin, and I'm not in the habit of speaking Mandarin, and they understand that it's just going to be difficult at first, then their progression to fluency thereafter will be a lot faster, a lot easier, and probably they'll end up much more proficient. The thing is, not many people get the bulk of their input in a language that they don't end up speaking. The national language will normally dominate the heritage language until it's the only language that they feel comfortable speaking. And once they get beyond childhood, it's just very rare that you'll get an adult who deliberately goes outside of their comfort zone and purposely speaks a language that they're not actually very comfortable in, even if, yes, okay, they've had a lot of input in that. And because of that, we don't really know how much of an advantage these people are at overall, but the supporters of the massive input theory are not suggesting that these people should just be fluent as soon as they try to start speaking. That's generally not what they're saying. Now, I do actually have an anecdote about this. My cousin, who grew up speaking only English, but hearing Japanese from her mother, only her mother. Long story short, at about the age of 15, she went from not speaking Japanese at all, and I really mean not being able to produce Japanese whatsoever, to doing so very fluently within about a year. What changed is that she took Japanese at school and was given no choice but the advanced class because her mother was Japanese, and in that class there were a lot of speaking exams and oral presentation assessments, so there she was forced to speak. And what's interesting here is that people who do take this path and then end up speaking the language very fluently may then be dismissed from the field of candidates as native speakers, even though in my cousin's case, at least, she's not a native speaker. She was a native listener, but she didn't speak a word of Japanese, and then in 1 year goes to completely fluent. Now, I think we can agree that that is not a normal thing to do in Australia. My cousin's eventual success could be used as evidence for any of the 3 schools of thought I've named, either for classroom study or for speaking or for massive input. My personal take on it would be that input alone is not enough, but it massively magnifies the results of speaking when speaking is eventually attempted. As I said, it's anecdotal, but it matches my own experience that speaking lots and lots of Swedish did very little to improve my fluency after about the 8-month mark. After that, I still believed that I could just keep speaking and that I'd eventually get good like that. So I kept speaking for another 2.5 years, but I never ever felt more comfortable speaking, and most notably, my comprehension of spoken Swedish barely moved an inch. I had actually been calling myself fluent in Swedish for a year when I first really committed to watching a whole series in Swedish without subtitles, and I was dismayed to find that I could barely understand what was happening. And I put this at around as late as June last year. So this is over 3 years of total Swedish now, and I still couldn't understand a series or a YouTube video. I had very vague comprehension. But in the last year, I've cut my speaking back by about 90% and focused instead that time on reading and listening as much as possible, and my overall competency in Swedish has massively improved. My personal feeling of it is that I'm more than twice as good as I was a year ago. And remember, this is after more than 3 years of Swedish and then only a year since I've gone to this different approach. For example, the interview with Claudia that I did a couple of months ago did it in Swedish, didn't really think anything of it, would never have done that a year ago, wouldn't have had the confidence to do it. If I'd been forced to do an interview in Swedish, I would have had to prepare for a very long time. I would have only been able to say set things, and I would have been very nervous whilst doing so and made tons of mistakes. Now, of course, I made mistakes in the interview. My Swedish is far from perfect, but it's way better than it was a year ago, just from taking a different approach. So this is the neatest rounding off point that I can find for part 1 of the video. Remember to stay tuned for part 2. It should be out already, depending on when you're watching this. In that one, we're going to talk more about the difference between language acquisition and language learning. Plus, Krashen brings up some interesting cultural and social aspects of language learning that I want to dig into. So I will see you then. Bye.